With the dust finally settling around Avengers Endgame, it's time to move on to discuss the latest summer blockbusters, and I thought where better than to discuss the first ever superhero film franchise, X-Men. Dark Phoenix is right around the corner, and the general consensus appears to be fans are uninterested in this film, and most critics believe this film will be bad. But why does it look all doom and gloom for Dark Phoenix? Why, when I see the trailers, am I detached from the characters on screen? Why do I not want to see the X-Men story play out? And I think I have the answer as to why this film has been placed in such a terrible position. And that reason is X-Men Days of Future Past. Now, X-Men Days of Future Past is a good X-Men film, but I think it ruined the future X-Men films coming off the back of the highly successful relaunch of the mutant team First Class. Days of Future Past was made to tie in the two timelines and try to add some continuity into the X-Men universe, and try and similarly launch a Marvel Cinematic Universe. Whilst Days of Future Past succeeded in adding some continuity into the X-Men universe, even if this was forgotten by the time X-Men Apocalypse rolled around, Days of Future Past failed in building a universe. And in this video, I want to dive into how Days of Future Past ruined X-Men Dark Phoenix.
Excuse me, I'm Eric Lenstra.
Charles Xavier.
Go yourself.
So what happens in Days of Future Past which essentially destroyed the X-Men universe? And I can answer that: neglecting supporting characters. It's no secret that the X-Men films have somewhat forgotten about their supporting characters, and have only really focused on three main characters, that being Professor X, Magneto and Wolverine, with some spotlight being shone on Mystique before Jennifer Lawrence had enough of the character. Days of Future Past is no exception to this rule, riding off the back of the extremely successful X-Men First Class, which focused on Professor X and Magneto in their mid-20s, forming the first incarnation of the X-Men team. First Class did something no other X-Men film had really done to this point, and that was have a solid, likeable supporting cast. By the end of First Class, I cared about the background characters. Each member of the team had some sort of backstory and personality, instead of being stern-faced, charisma drains. You cared about this team's struggles, and for me at least, I wanted to see where they would go with this new team, and was looking forward to them growing as a team similar to, say, another superhero team, which has grown and developed over the years. First Class was the perfect setup for a future X-Men series, and even the beginning of the foundations of an X-Men universe. So what went wrong to find us in the situation of an X-Men film that has no memorable characters? Days of Future Past made the bizarre creative choice of killing all the X-Men team off besides Professor X, Magneto, Mystique and Beast, with all these deaths of minor characters taking place off screen. This whole point is very much glossed over, with the only character reacting to this being Mystique, who had little connection with many of the characters. Yes, she was part of the original X-Men team, but left very early on. This makes the deaths of the original team feel pretty cheap and meaningless. Within one film of a whole ensemble of characters being introduced, they are immediately killed off screen with no warning, just gone. So if you connected with them anyway in First Class, forget about it, because they're dead and that's that. What is even more bizarre Days of Future Past did, in my opinion, is essentially re-establish all the original X-Men characters without any intention of telling future stories with these characters. Essentially, you have a film which establishes a young up-and-coming cast who could carry a franchise for a few years, and instead of building upon their stories, Fox decided to kill them all off in the sequel and establish a cast of actors who haven't played these characters for nearly 10 years, whilst having no intention of furthering the character's story except with prequels with an entirely new cast. What Fox have done is set up a universe with First Class, practically reboot it with the following film of Days of Future Past, and then establish a new roster of characters with X-Men Apocalypse. Basically, Days of Future Past acted as either a complete reboot or a finale of the X-Men saga, with X-Men Apocalypse being another new reboot. We are now in a position where an almost entirely new X-Men team has been established with X-Men Apocalypse, and now this team, which has had little to no build up, will be taking part in probably the biggest X-Men story ever printed.
Here, you're pretty strong for a scrawny kid. Come on. Sure there's not a little beast in there? Come on.
Days of Future Past should have been a film where the First Class team worked together in order to prevent the Sentinels from destroying the future. That way, the First Class team is given some backstory and built up in a meaningful way, connecting more with the audience. Perhaps one or two characters are introduced like Jean Grey and Scott Summers, thus giving an early introduction to these characters and giving them some characterization over a couple of films before making them the stars of the staple X-Men film. My major problem with Days of Future Past is that it appears Fox decided that First Class was bad and ignored the major plot points of that film. First Class ends on Professor X becoming paralysed. It's an emotional scene where the mutants pick sides and Charles' good friend Mystique abandons him. It truly shows how Professor X is in his lowest point, and by Days of Future Past, he's up walking again. Sure, he lost his powers, but why even bother putting him in the wheelchair in the first place? It's just lazy to me. Magneto as well is leaving with the Brotherhood of Mutants in this scene. So here we have the first incarnation of the team. They save Emma Frost, and we end on Eric saying, "Call me Magneto." And it's hinted at that this is beginning of his Brotherhood of Mutants. And we also know they now have a telepath on their team. But by the start of Days of Future Past, his whole team is dead and Magneto's in prison. So what was even the point of showing these scenes of the team forming and then rescuing Emma Frost? The whole cast basically resets by the start of Days of Future Past. Anything that could have been built upon in First Class is lost. The characters are abandoned and stories which were set up by this film are left by the wayside to make room for returning actors such as Hugh Jackman, Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen and Halle Berry, who granted at the time were bigger actors than the First Class cast, but this is where Fox went wrong. Whilst Marvel invested in emerging actors, Fox focused on bringing back the old guard, who actually wouldn't be in many films past Days of Future Past, compared to the young cast of First Class, which could have been tied down to long contracts and been in a lot of films in the future. This is where I feel the problems with Dark Phoenix originate from. Days of Future Past, as mentioned, just resets everything, and X-Men Apocalypse had to reintroduce the X-Men and the X-Men team as a whole. The only characters who will be in Dark Phoenix who are actually in First Class are Professor X, Beast and Magneto, and this story won't actually focus on any of these characters. Whilst the cast of Dark Phoenix were all mainly introduced in Apocalypse, a film which was received poorly, and for me it may be one of the worst X-Men films. For me, it just doesn't make much sense to do a film which tears a team apart when they haven't even become a team yet. This incarnation of X-Men have had one mission together on screen, and one member of the team was against them for most of it, being Storm. Compare this to Civil War and you feel the magnitude of the film due to seeing these characters for 8 years on various adventures, and we understand their relationships with one another. Days of Future Past could have been another piece of that puzzle of creating an iconic X-Men team. Instead, Days of Future Past serves little story purpose within the X-Men universe, other than to serve getting Professor X back in the wheelchair and opening up his school, which he'd already done in First Class. Every character ends Days of Future Past at exactly the same point that they were in First Class. None of the characters actually grow or change in any meaningful way. They've simply returned to where they were at the end of First Class. But I guess this doesn't matter anymore. As the rights move over to Marvel, I have little hope for Dark Phoenix, but I think it's an interesting discussion to look at how previous X-Men films, which may have actually affected this film. As we know, the X-Men films are very much a mixed bag of quality, and I think Fox could have made a lot more better choices in creating a cinematic universe, which is clearly what they were trying to go for with Days of Future Past, and I think instead they made a fitting finale. But as I always say, I think superhero films owe a lot to the original X-Men films, and I think they were the real jumping off point in making superhero films mainstream. I will go see Dark Phoenix, but as we all know, this will probably be the last X-Men film, as all the rights are passed over to Marvel, and it just doesn't feel like an actual conclusion of this universe, more than just another cash grab story, which is a massive shame. Thank you for watching.